As Dragon Quest VIII starts up, the player is told how to move and then promptly thrust into their first combat. 3 slimes serve as a tutorial enemy. They're the least threatening enemies in the game, so players will have a hard time losing this fight. Combat is a turn-based affair in Dragon Quest VIII, a rarity even back in 2005. However, because Dragon Quest VIII strictly uses menu-based combat, players can become more familiar with fighting simply by reading the menus. Turns take as long as the player needs, and the mechanics are simple, so there's no need to give a traditional hand-fisted tutorial. All the devs have to do is put in some basic tooltips for the player so they can get started. Most of the combat in the opening segment of this game is tutorialized in this fashion, with each new concept introduced slowly and simply. Skill points aren't introduced until a few levels are gained. Skills themselves are gained only after multiple levels worth of skill points are invested. The first skills you get are passive and thus don't require any activation in combat. Each layer of depth is brought to the player's attention as slowly as possible and as simply as possible. As a result, the game is able to have complicated mechanics without needing to hold the player's hand. The opening segment of this game is mechanically superb, as it provides an easy point of access for new players and a quick jumping off point for veterans. If there is one thing that I have a problem with in this first area, it's the first dungeon boss.
Wahaha! Surprise! Surprise! Meet Giza. I am the master of this waterfall.
As a character, he's great, but he has a terrible introduction to psyching up. Psyching up is a mechanic that is unique to Dragon Quest VIII. In exchange for doing nothing on a turn, the character powers up his or her next turn. Psyching up multiple times stacks the damage boost, but if the player gets stunned or immobilized in any way, they lose the psych up boost and have to start over. The boost more than doubles attack, so it's worth it from a damage standpoint. However, it's rarely worth it on small enemies, since 1 or 2 attacks can kill them easily. So the clever player might deduce that psyching up is only good for bosses. However, the player character is needed for healing, and Yangus gets stunned easily, so greedy players will never get a full psych up hit on Geezer. As a result, if the player attempted psyching up in this battle, they might come to think that psyching up is never worth it, which isn't true. Psyching up is in fact crucial to defeating the toughest bosses in the game. In an area so well crafted for teaching new players the basics, this one scenario stands out as relatively inadequate. Not to mention that this makes the boss somewhat difficult for the first dungeon, albeit that's not much of a problem when you consider that the whole game is a little bit difficult. The difficulty of the game comes from the combat encounters being slightly unfair. Although this is a turn-based game, the way the game decides which character goes first in a fight is pseudo-random. The agility stat is a factor, but it's far from consistent. As a result, it's impossible to not take damage from enemies. Even weak ones will get hits off constantly. Unless the party is incredibly overleveled, they'll get worn down quickly, which granted, adds tension when exploring a dungeon or walking into the next town, but this tension comes at the price of making bosses inconsistent and stale. Since the turn order is random, sometimes bosses will take their turn last, and then take their turn first, giving players no time to heal in between attacks. The best way to avoid getting party wiped by this is to play very cautiously. Always have defensive buffs up. Keep everyone near max HP, and then attack. In the later half of the game, this becomes the only viable strategy, and in a game with so many skill trees and items and magic and weapons, it's frustrating to be shoehorned into just one playstyle, not to mention a little bit boring. Another issue regarding difficulty is how developers make certain enemies easier or harder. Rather than adjusting stats to make a monster hit harder or softer, the devs instead add junk moves to the monster's roster of moves. These moves do no damage or status effect or anything. There tends to be a bit of flavor added to these junk moves, but for all intents and purposes, the vast majority of enemies, even bosses, will sometimes just skip their turn. This makes most of the enemies in the game easier without making them weaker, which is useful for establishing tension in each fight, but it also adds in additional inconsistency. I mentioned skills briefly, but let's go a little bit deeper into the leveling systems available to the party. Stats gained from levels don't affect the character a great deal. Each upgrade is extremely incremental, so the real benefit to leveling is skill points. Each character has 5 skill trees they can invest points into, and they range from 1 to 100 in each tree. At certain intervals, a skill is obtained, but leveling doesn't guarantee a skill. In fact, each level gives an arbitrary amount of skill points. Sometimes characters get 3 skill points, and other times it can be up to 9. Not only that, but a character can level upwards of 4 times before receiving enough skill points to obtain 1 skill in 1 tree. Each character has 4 weapon skill trees and a special skill tree. Characters will also learn guaranteed skills through leveling. Skills learned inside the weapon skill trees only apply when the weapon is equipped, while the special skill tree is always active. To balance this, the special tree is rarely given combat bonuses. Many of the weapon skill trees give passive damage increases, making skills more desirable than levels. Playing through the whole game with a bit of grinding can let characters comfortably master 2 skill trees. Investing in a weapon skill tree means investing in a type of weapon. Switching weapons in combat does not cost a turn, so mastering 2 weapons in order to compensate for weaknesses is an extremely viable strategy. The skill system does allow for some customization of your characters, and each skill tree is viable. There's definitely stronger and weaker ones, but nothing a little bit of grinding won't overcome. The biggest problem with skills in Dragon Quest VIII is that you can't refund them. Each point allocation is permanent. Making a mistake in a character build isn't the end of the world, but it hinders experimentation. To compound this problem, in-game knowledge of skills is scarce. There is no way to obtain detailed information on a specific skill within a specific skill tree without allocating points and seeing for yourself. This makes min-maxing your characters impossible without using a guide. The worst part about this is that the game does have a designated NPC that gives information on skills. However, the information is not very detailed. She gives how many skill points to the next level, and a brief overview of the skill tree in general. The overview gives out hints as to some of the skills in the tree, but nothing specific, like when you get these skills, or if the skills deal AoE or single target damage. On the subject of hiding information, Dragon Quest VIII lacks some normally standard quality of life features, namely the ability to see enemy health, weaknesses, and resistances. The absence of these features don't make the game unplayable, but it's frustrating, especially not seeing enemy resistances and weaknesses. In fact, enemy resistances and weaknesses are so hidden that it took me a while to realize that many enemies have elemental preferences. The most obvious one is that using fire against tree monsters deals increased damage, but there are some not so obvious ones as well, like how wind attacks don't work on capes. Another frustrating example is the use of status effects. Status effects don't proc 100% of the time. In fact, they don't even proc 50% of the time. So whenever you cast a status ailment spell on an enemy, you can't tell if the enemy is immune to the spell, or the spell simply doesn't proc that time and you should cast it again. These 2 factors combined make combat spells unreliable. As a side note, the spell Zing might be one of the most frustrating spells I've ever had to use in a game. The spell revives one character 50% of the time, and the other 50% the spell does nothing, leading to one situation during a difficult boss fight where the party was wiped out because one character failed the Zing spell multiple times in a row. Even if this only happens once or twice in a playthrough, it was still extremely off-putting. Reviving in general is quite difficult in Dragon Quest VIII. Early on, the only way to revive a character who dies in combat is to walk to the nearest church and pay a fee to revive them. Later on in the game, the party obtains the Yggdrasil leaf, a consumable item that revives a character, but the game doesn't hand these out. The first time you can obtain one of these leaves is on the 3rd continent, in the middle of a forest, only at dusk or dawn, and you can only pick it up if you don't currently have any in your inventory. The second way to obtain a Yggdrasil leaf is to buy one from the Argonian Bazaar. However, it's the same deal here. You can only buy one if you have 0 in your inventory. It's an interesting choice to not have any way to revive someone early game without returning to town. It gives the roles a hint of danger and makes even one party member dying a costly inconvenience. Death is handled differently in this game than in others. Traditionally, once the party has been wiped, you have to load up a save point and start all over from that save point onwards. Dragon Quest VIII system works in a similar way with a few differences. First is that you don't lose progress in the story upon dying, nor do you lose items or experience points. All that is retained upon death. What you do lose is half of your gold, and you respawn at the last church you saved in. This makes dying very forgiving, and in case of bosses is actually quite entertaining. Losing to a boss and then re-challenging them to a fight procs a different cutscene, usually with a boss bragging about how badly he beat you last time. I would actually recommend dying to a few of the bosses just to see some bonus content, if it didn't completely destroy your savings. These death mechanics keep the game from being punishing, despite it being difficult. Speaking of dying, I want to come out against Dolmagus. Dolmagus marks the middle of the game, and his boss is something that has been foreshadowed since the game started. As a result, he has 2 forms. Each of these forms alone make for a difficult boss fight. But to make matters worse, a new mechanic is introduced in this fight. Dolmagus is able to cast a buff-canceling spell that removes any buffs that you might have cast on the party. This means that the only way to combat Dolmagus effectively is to out-heal the damage he inflicts, since buffing is no longer as reliable. However, Dolmagus gets to have 2 turns per round, and he constantly casts powerful AoE attacks. This amount of damage is simply too much for 2 healers with only full heal to keep up with. So if we factor all the other information I've covered in this review so far in this fight, He removes buff spells, attack spells don't deal any damage, diva spells don't work either half the time or he's immune, and Dolmegus outdamages what the party can heal. What does that leave for strategic options? Almost nothing. The only way I found to reliably beat Dolmegus is to grind Angelo up to level 30, which is when he gets multi-heal. This is the main reason I find Dolmegus to be terrible, not because of any particular design decisions, because to reliably beat him, I needed to grind for levels. So it all kind of comes down to grinding. Grinding can be a bit unavoidable when it comes to this particular genre of game, but it's still a pet peeve of mine. Before we're going to do all the horrible things grinding does for my overall experience, let's mention all the good things it does. The number one biggest positive grinding does for a game is it allows for players at any time to adjust the game's difficulty. Is the boss too hard? Grind out some levels. Want more of a challenge? Then skip through some of the fights. Dynamic difficulty like this gives developers a lot of wiggle room when it comes to balancing their game. Nothing ever has to be too exact in power levels, since the players can compensate for lack of power, and any weapon or armor too powerful gets quickly outclassed as the player proceeds through the game. In fact, this dynamic difficulty is why the alchemy pot is able to craft such powerful gear at such a low level. This game has been designed around the fact that players can and will grind for levels. There are two reasons why I hate grinding in this game in particular. First is that enemies give very little experience. To give you an idea, I played this game for roughly 75 hours, and by the end of it, my highest level character was 50. The standard mob in Dragon Quest VIII simply doesn't provide enough experience to level up comfortably. The only reasonable way to grind is to fight metal slimes, and even fighting constant metal slimes, it still took about 90 minutes to grind Angelo up to level 30. For this alone, grinding is a terrible value proposition, and I was grinding on something that gives 5 times the experience of a regular mob. If the players didn't know about this metal slime forest here, then they could be grinding for hours to get Angelo up to level 30. The other reason is that leveling is very unsatisfying. Stats actually do very little to alter the strength of your party. Increasing in level just simply doesn't change very much. You might do 2 to 3 more damage, or you might receive 1 to 2 points less damage, but that's nowhere near enough to be worth all the effort. The game is actually quite doable at a relatively low level because stats are trivial compared to equipment and skills, so even though the party gained almost 7 levels each, none of those level ups felt important. None of it felt meaningful. The party didn't feel any stronger. The only thing that felt important is that last level to 30 with only Angelo. Dolmegus stands out like a sore thumb on the difficulty curve, but his negatives are easily balanced out by his positives. I dislike the grinding that Dolmegus inflicts, but that doesn't change the fact that Dolmegus' difficulty reinforces the overarching narrative. From the very start of the game, Dolmegus is the goal. From Fairbury to the Abbey, he is the cause of the problems afflicting the land, and the personal reason most of the party is journeying. Not to mention the build-up to the reveal of Dolmegus is fantastic. He starts out as just a bit of exposition in Fairbury, then builds up to an unseen murderer in Alexandria, becomes capable of warping the minds of monsters from just walking past them in the port, and only then is he revealed in the Abbey just before killing the abbot. In every way, Dolmegus is built up as the final boss of the game, so it makes sense that he would be far stronger than every boss before him. It makes sense he would have 2 forms. It makes sense that the fight feels like it's pushing the party into a corner. Even after the fight, the game reinforces Dolmegus' strength. The bosses after Dolmegus aren't actually stronger than Dolmegus. Instead, they rely on gimmicks. The boss in Arcadia has to be fought with only 3 party members, and the boss in Irkutsk is actually just a huge mob of slightly difficult enemies, none of which pose a threat by themselves. This gives the players a lot of breathing room before having to fight a singularly powerful boss again, and as a result, it reinforces Dolmegus as a powerful enemy. Dolmegus might be my least favorite boss to fight, but he's the best from a narrative perspective, and it's refreshing to encounter such a well-made villain. Traveling in Dragon Quest VIII is an incredibly refined experience. Most of the game is spent out in the open fields, running and exploring from town to town and dungeon to dungeon. And as a result, a lot of time and energy went into making this enjoyable and rewarding. Much like the combat system, exploring is tutorialized by starting out simple and then slowly ramping up, while making the levels interesting enough to entertain veterans of the series. The first area the player is allowed to explore is the town of Fairbury. The only instructions upon entering the town are to find Rylus. No description of Rylus is given, no quest objective is given, and the town map is generally useless. So the only way to find Rylus is to explore. The town isn't very big, and the player is unable to leave at this time, so the developers simply let the player run around. Exploring all the houses and buildings in Fairbury could potentially take up to 10 to 15 minutes, but the trigger to the next event can be located and found in a matter of moments, once again allowing new players some time to grasp certain town mechanics while giving veterans a quick way to skip forward. This is all to prepare for that big reveal of the overworld. When the player first walks out of town, it doesn't give a cutscene or any point of interest within the area. If it did give a dramatic look at all the places you can go, it would also reveal the only places you could go. Fairbury, the waterfall cave, the red tree, and the hut on the top of the hill. Those are the only truly notable places the player is allowed to go at this point. But when first starting out, the player doesn't know that. The Fairbury section of the game is large enough that it can be difficult to grasp the edges of the map, especially since boundaries are naturally gated off by mountains and rivers. This leads to the illusion of a complete open world and a true sense of freedom. Not to mention, it's more memorable to find the hut on the top of the waterfall yourself, and then to complete the Cheese Man's quest yourself. It's more entertaining to get lost in the world map than it is to know the way. This lack of knowledge makes exploration less efficient and better. Details and locations of towns and dungeons aren't handed out on a map either, but told to the player in the form of directions. Head north over the hill. Head towards Simpleton but make an immediate left. Even something as simple as head south to reach Pickham is somewhat exhilarating. Since the map is so useless, finding these places feels like going off the beaten track. It feels like exploring. And to date, Dragon Quest VIII is the only classic JRPG that made exploring feel so intriguing to me. This all could have gone quite badly. Most of the tutorialization appears very hands-off, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. This type of introduction is much more intensive on the developer than anything else. Everything from buildings to NPCs to dungeon design to quest design is meticulously crafted to be obvious without breaking immersion. If the user interface was clunky during combat, new players might not beat the first few encounters. If the town was too big, then it could take so long to find clues about Rice that players might get bored and leave before even getting into the field. In the field, players might not know that the waterfall has a cave behind it and miss it entirely. The best way to fix this would be to make all these tutorials more obvious, more hand-holdy. But then it wouldn't feel satisfying to explore, to discover, or to play. Another solution is to add quest markers, but that takes a lot of the fun out of exploring as well. So instead of doing that, the devs meticulously handcrafted everything in this first area, from how fast you gain levels, to the items in the shop, to the enemies you can encounter in the field, to how big the field is, to how often monsters drop medicinal herbs, to where the shop's located in the towns, to how much money the player can make from mobs, to how much everything interacts with everything. All this is done just so new players can play the game well, even by accident. There's a lot less raw mechanics in towns than combat. Players can talk to NPCs, buy and sell to vendors and shops, interact with bookcases for lore and alchemy recipes. While this is all very simple, it gets a bit more interesting once the day-night cycle gets factored in. Having a day-night cycle gives each town 2 faces to wear, and in general, emphasizes the character of the town. Fairbury, for instance, is a relatively warm and welcoming place, but at night, the armor vendor offers a shady deal with a thief's key, giving the whole town an added bit of depth. No one town is completely full of one type of character. It's all a bit of a melting pot to a degree. Sure, there are preferences. Pickham is full of thieves, and the Holy Isle of Neos is full of priests, but even within these towns you still have the rich and the poor, the honest and the dishonest, the kind and the cruel. And this keeps each town feeling fresh and alive. Characters present in the game are extremely well done. From your party to town citizens to monsters, everyone has a different way of speaking, dressing, and acting. This is reinforced by the frankly fantastic voice acting within the game. Each new town brings with it a new accent and cadence. Even the non-voice acted NPCs have speech impediments and tics to illustrate a cohesive stereotype for that particular town. Monsters are given a similar treatment. Not all monsters are bad, and some will even interact with a party. The dialogue with monsters is purposely exaggerated to help establish individual monster unique characteristics. Slimes make bubbling noises, tree monsters make shaking sounds, barbarians cackle evilly even when discussing mundane things. By far my favorite of these monster encounters is the imp in the chapel at Tyrant Gully, who constantly insults and berates the party even while praying for a blessing from the goddess. Nothing quite matches your own party characters though.
We got one! We got one! I was picking me I was picking me some flowers when I saw it.
Jessica, Angelo, and King Trode are beautifully brought to life. Each of their stories are relevant to the overarching plot, they all have wonderful chemistry, and if you push the start button regularly for hints, you'll get plenty of amusing dialogue from all of them. This is helpful since for the most part, your party characters only subtly intrude in the story, and it's possible to not hear from them for hours at a time, even while completing story events. Each one of them are fantastic companions, especially Yangus. Yangus is by far my personal favorite, from his inability to pronounce big words, to his backstory as a down-his-luck bandit turning over a new leaf. Even his hometown of Pickham is one of my favorite towns. He even has one of the best, and a little creepy, start button dialogues in the game. Speaking of creepy things that I love...
Yes, the sights, the sounds, the smells! Over the monster arena!
The Monster Arena is one of the best ongoing side quests that plays out for most of the game and gives the party a lot of extra power and utility fairly early on. The Monster Arena allows players the ability to catch certain monsters that can be seen wandering in the overworld. Once these monsters are caught, they can eventually be used to fight in place of the party for a few turns. You can only have 3 monsters in each battle party at a given time, but that's more than enough. The monsters wandering the overworld can be likened to bosses in many cases. Most will be somewhat weak, stronger than normal monsters to be sure, but still no match for a full party, and some will be incredibly powerful, with far more health and damage to the party, and it's possible to capture 3 such beings and make them fight your enemies. The catch is that you can't control them, the monsters work off their own individual AI. This side quest is a fantastic addition to the game. It reinforces world map exploration, their strategy in choosing monsters with raw strength over monsters with strong utility, and the Monster Arena itself offers other great rewards for completing all of its challenges. There are many good quests and distractions in this game, but the Monster Arena is more important than the others due to its nature of exploring the world map. Since the player is gated off from certain sections of the world until a certain point in the story, this means that the Monster Arena is also gated off by these same criteria. You can only realistically get so far in the Monster Arena before it becomes prudent to continue the main story. This is important for pacing purposes. Spending 10 hours running around the world focusing on the Monster Arena would be fun, but it would undermine the central narrative, so instead they use it to supplement the central narrative's expected slow points. Things like exploring that last bit of map for treasure, or grinding for money, or even just a long walk to the next town is made more enjoyable with the addition of the Monster Arena's catching mechanics. The orchestral music you've been hearing this whole time deserves a mention. If you haven't figured it out yet, it's the soundtrack to the game. At least it is for the American PlayStation 2 version. For this particular game, the soundtrack is what really defines the mood and feel of the game's world. It might be the only reason some of you gave the video the time of day. Thank you, by the way. The music is fantastic, but I wanted to mention the combat music in particular is a little bit lacking. Not in quality, but in quantity. The same basic combat music is used for the entirety of the game, with the exception of bosses and mini-bosses. It's a mild gripe, but it gets exacerbated by the game's length. Individual towns might share some music, but they've spaced out the repeats so you don't quite notice immediately. It would alleviate some of the repetitiveness to have some additional soundtracks rotation in combat. The music in the game is all fantastic, but it's hard to like a song after 60 plus hours of listening to it. The dungeons in this game suffer a bit from the slow and steady ideology the developers use for the rest of the game. They start out very simple and slowly build up like everything else, but very little is introduced on each individual dungeon. The only new exploration mechanic that's introduced in the second dungeon is buttons. There is no puzzle element. Just press the buttons to proceed. And there are no buttons to press in the next dungeon, or the one after that. Most dungeons in Dragon Quest VIII don't build off the mechanics the previous dungeon introduces. The devs never appear comfortable in exploring the designs these gimmicks offer, so each gimmick errs on the side of overly simplistic. Herb Grotto and Royal Hunting Grounds feel particularly clunky. Each mechanic is introduced, then given 2 to 3 basic iterations, and then forgotten about for the rest of the game. And since each of these respective dungeons revolves around these mechanics, the whole experience can be a little lackluster. The only time when dungeons don't suffer these gimmicks are when these gimmicks synchronize well with the standard exploration. Trodane's Castle is the first dungeon in the game where it's easy to get lost due to its multiple entrances and thus non-linear design. Swordsman's Labyrinth's level design misleads the player into multiple poison pitfalls, but the dungeon map will show what's real and what is a trick. Rather than installing a feeling of progression in dungeon design, there appears to be a greater emphasis on making everything memorable. The final dungeon is the best example of this. The Black Citadel is one of the longest dungeons in the game, with 2 main parts that make up the dungeon: the barracks and the tower. The barracks is a pure maze, multiple directions and pathways crisscross with each other constantly, and as a whole is most likely the easiest dungeon to get turned around in. The tower itself is also maze-like, but it's entirely vertical, making the map substantially less useful due to its inability to show multiple floors at the same time. This is counteracted by allowing the players to look over the railings of the tower to see where to go next, which encourages players to focus on their surroundings and find their own path. This is also the only vertically inclined dungeon where the emphasis is on traversing downwards instead of upwards. The Black Citadel is much longer than any other dungeon, but that's only because it's multiple dungeons combined into one. While aesthetically both dungeons are similar, mechanically each segment differs greatly, not to mention it's possible to leave after completing the first half and then come back without losing progress. Each of these dungeons seem to have their own identity built into the design. This is what makes them unique and memorable, but it also prevents most mechanics from being reintroduced and built upon. Normally the final dungeon is used as a sort of final exam, a test to see if the player has learned from all the other past dungeons. So it's strange to see all the work put into previous dungeons completely abandoned. Why have Munchie segments at all if he wasn't going to play a pivotal role at the very end? Why bother introducing the pitfalls if they are never going to be expanded upon? Or weight puzzles, or levers, or even buttons? The final dungeon does have its own identity and a feel to it, which is always an impressive feat. The game introduces a ton of dungeon mechanics, and to not go back to any of them, not even the good ones, is a missed opportunity. I appreciate the variety that this design choice gave me in most of the game, but in the end it would have been a bit more satisfying had everything come together in a bit more of a satisfying way. I would also like to mention the circular town segment right before the boss. This segment doesn't offer any new exploration mechanics, but has a nice bit of storytelling built into it. At first, no encounters occur and the town looks normal. As a player slowly moves through the town, it starts to get more and more damaged, and then monsters start spawning, and this gets worse and worse until the town simply turns into a prison, and the door to Rapthorn appears. It's a fantastic little segment, and one of the most unique aspects of the final dungeon. After beating the Black Citadel, the game is essentially over, and all the player has to do is collect the Dragon Orbs from across the world so they can get access to the final boss. But this isn't a challenge so much as a chance to look back on the journey that brought the party this far. The search for the Dragon Orbs requires players to go back to the homes and graves of the Seven Sages that had been murdered by Rapthorn. This also allows players to go back to each town and pick up any quests that they might have missed, or just chat one last time to their favorite characters. In another game this might be inconvenient, but this game gets away with it just because how charming the world is. It's nice to have a chance to say goodbye before it all ends. The final boss of the game is Rapthorn, with all of his power at his disposal, the true Lord of Darkness. When the party first enters the battle, Rapthorn is completely immune to all damage. He also gets 2 moves per turn, deals high AoE damage, and casts powerful sleep spells to temporarily incapacitate the party. The only way to remove his invulnerability is for the party to use the staff that originally sealed him 7 times. It only counts as used if everyone in the party uses the staff on the same turn, meaning that the party will be skipping its entire turn 7 times in this fight. It's a novel mechanic, and I'm glad it doesn't show up ever again. It changes the way the party fights, which no other late game boss does, but it primarily just makes the player even more defensive than they already were, and after using the staff 7 times, it turns into another standard boss battle of heal up and deal safe damage. There is a nice role reversal, however, since for the entire game enemies have been occasionally skipping their turn, and now in the final boss the main mechanic for beating them is for the party to skip their turn as well. The novelty of skipping your own turn wears off pretty quickly, so it's a good thing it only happens in this one boss fight. Thankfully, throwing a new mechanic at the very end makes the fight more memorable and keeps the player on their toes all the way up to the end. Once Rapthorn dies, everything is finally over, and you're treated to a cutscene where Medea and King Trode return to normal, Trode Castle, along with everyone inside, revives, and everyone eats a big feast with a nice happily ever after. But there is one more cutscene to view before the game ends. One last bit of closure. Throughout the game, it's been hinted that your player character and Medea could be in a romantic relationship, but she is betrothed to the Prince of Argonia, Charmles. I've shown Charmles before because he is ridiculous and clearly a terrible person. The last cutscene of the game focuses around their wedding. It's been a few months since Rapthorn's been killed and the party is reunited again to see the wedding. You get a bit of exposition explaining what the other characters have been up to since the battle, but this cutscene is mostly about the player character, Medea, and Charmles. In the end, the player character runs off with the princess during the wedding, and they all live happily ever after. So it's hardly original, but it's strange that this cutscene in particular is so focused on what the player character wants. Not the player, but the silent protagonist himself. Normally focusing on the personal motivations of a silent protagonist doesn't make much sense. For the last 50 hours or so, the player character hasn't wanted anything. He wants whatever we want, because we control his actions. For all intents and purposes, the player character is the player, and separating them at this last minute to focus on his story is a little bit jarring. Especially since everyone is asking him what he wants, as if he is having some sort of internal struggle regarding Medea being married to Charmles. But he isn't a person. He has almost no character. He smiles occasionally during a cutscene, and sometimes he's angry during a cutscene, but he doesn't speak, or complete actions by himself, or anything without player input. The player character can't be having an internal struggle. He has no internals. The player is supposed to be the internals. Regardless, though, the player character steals Medea in the middle of the wedding and escapes back to Trodain, where they live happily ever after. At this point, the credits roll and the game is officially over. Fortunately, Dragon Quest VIII features quite a bit of endgame content, particularly with the Dragovian village and trials afterwards. After the credits roll, you get access to a cutscene, showing you where the bonus content is located, and the party is promptly dropped into the world again, just before beating Rapthorn. Finding this content unlocks the hardest dungeon in the game by far. It's not quite as long as a Black Citadel, but offers no healing, no shortcuts, and vicious, brutal enemies capable of dealing more damage than Rapthorn himself. The dungeon takes roughly an hour to complete, and that was with reduced enemy encounters via Padfoot and Holy Water. It does offer some of the best armor and weapons within the dungeon, but not enough for the whole party to receive upgrades, at least if you've been on top of such things. After now, the party is introduced to the town located after the dungeon, the Dragovian Village. The Dragovian Village has a gigantic flaw already in that it isn't connected to the rest of the world via the world map, which makes it feel like it's not a part of the world at all. For some games this wouldn't be an issue, but Dragon Quest VIII lives and dies based on that world building. The world map is the reason to play this game. The reason everything else works so well is partly due to its place in the world map. There are good reasons why it's not on the world map, but regardless of reason, it loses a little bit of the charm the rest of the towns have. Not only that, but this section of the game explains the backstory of the player character and Munchie. Munchie's a dragon, and also your grandfather. The statement is so ridiculous that it's almost funny. The dragon origins of Munchie make sense considering his ability to breathe numerous effects after eating cheese, but being the player character's grandfather opens a whole bag of story-related issues. For instance, if Munchie is a sophisticated adult capable of reasoning, why does he need to eat cheese before he helps the party? And is it just really creepy that you have an old man in your pocket the whole game? The situation just puts a strange lens over the rest of the game that I'm not really a fan of. Once the quest to defeat the Dragon Lord ends, the party gets one last story realization about the player character. Turns out his mother was a dragon, and his father was the older brother of the current Argonian king, making the player character not only royalty, but technically he has more claim to the Argonian throne than either Prince Charmles or even the current king. If the final boss is defeated after this, the player is rewarded with a different ending where Charmles gets denounced by his father, is replaced by the player character as the next king of Argonia, and as a result loses the right to marry Medea at his own wedding. It's a nice, cheerful ending, well worth the effort of going through the Dragovian quest line. After the party learns of the player character's true origins, unlocks Dragovian trials. The Lord of Dragovians is still standing in the same spot you defeated him at, and if the party is willing to undergo the trials, then he will fight the party once more, first in his human form, then as a new secondary dragon form. There are 7 dragons in total, each one stronger than the final boss, and each one stronger than the last. But to entice players, there is also 6 rewards, and the party may choose which to receive after each fight. Once you defeat a dragon, or they kill you, the party spawns at the village and the trek through dice must be completed again. Most of the rewards are equipment, but by far the best reward is an upgrade to the alchemy pot, which allows for instantaneous crafting. Note, if you are playing on the 3DS, then this is actually a permanent upgrade from the very start of the game, but in the PlayStation 2 version, this is required. It doesn't immediately make the party stronger, but it cuts time for making the best armor, weapons, and accessories drastically. Besides having the ability to craft powerful gear quickly, the Dragovian trial rewards are Hev, a Metal King slime for the monster arena, and the Dragovian armor set, sword, and shield. The armor set does change the player character's outfit, which is a nice touch. The fights to go through before getting these rewards are brutal, and not in an enjoyable way. While most of the boss fights in Dragon Quest VIII do provide a fair bit of tension, the trials bump the difficulty to an extreme level, and this magnifies some of the problems within the game to a ridiculous degree. The issue of not having a standard turn order becomes much more problematic, as all the dragons have the ability to kill any party member with 1 or 2 desperate attacks, and all the dragons get to go twice per turn. Meaning if the dragon goes last in a turn, and then first in the next turn, they will kill party members at full health, without any chance to heal, or guard, or defend, or anything. If this character isn't Angelo, then you just use the Kazing spell. But if it is Angelo, then the only guaranteed revival method is either Yggdrasil's Leaf, which you can only have 1 of, or the player character casting Zing. If Zing does proc, then Angelo comes back with half health, and then can be immediately one-shot all over again. It's an infuriating loop that can happen far too often. The only real way to get around it is to have Jessica max out the sorcery tree and learn Kazing herself, that way you'll have 2 characters. But that can be difficult if you haven't already invested points into sorcery. Since you can't refund skill points into a different tree, the only thing the party can do is grind for skill points. If it was just grinding, it wouldn't be so bad, but at this point in the game the party is fairly high level, and if you're perceptive, then you'll start to notice that after every level up, you get less and less stats and skill points. For example, when Yangus hits level 46, he gains a 2 HP increase. However, when Yangus hits level 32, he gains a 22 HP increase, and after that he gains another 20 HP, and after that he gains another 18. Skill points start to slowly dwindle off as well. At high 40s, the party will only get 2 skill points on average per level, and even higher levels the party will get 0 skill points. This means grinding doesn't work anymore, but the game doesn't tell you this. It just silently turns off its dynamic difficulty. It's also hard to notice since most levels in Dragon Quest VIII fluctuate stats and skill points anyways. On one level, a party member might gain 9 skill points, and the next level they'll gain 4, only for it to go up to 7 on the next level. All of this combined resulted in a very unfortunate situation where I grinded for almost 10 hours for little to no benefit. The whole point of this grinding is to get to the Kazing spell in order to get around every dragon's standard attack strength. Higher tier dragons have special effects they can cast, or they're just on by default. One dragon casts a binding spell on the party, making every physical attack miss, meaning you can only reliably hit him with magic attacks. And Yangus only learns one reliable magic attack after investing 100 points into scythes. And the player character only learns a reliable magic attack after investing either 100 points into courage and or swords. One dragon is covered in metal and can only take significant damage from critical hits, meaning either Yangus or the player character has to heavily invest in either axes or spears. And if you want the best healing spell in the game, then you have to invest heavily in courage for the player character. No other character learns that spell. All this added together means you have to grind or farm for skill points for a ridiculous amount of time, or plan on fighting the dragons from the start of the game, and choose the correct skill tree for each character. Neither of these options can be considered reasonable. But even if you did do all these things, you are still not guaranteed to kill the last dragon. The last dragon can only be fought after beating all other dragons boss rush style, back to back to back. The final dragon gets 3 moves per turn, and if he targets the same character for each of those attacks, he kills them. If he casts 3 AoE attacks, he kills Jessica or Angelo. If he psychs up and attacks, he kills whoever he wants. I didn't defeat him. I didn't want to defeat him. I was burned out and dying, and running back through the same dungeon, and fighting a huge boss rush battle that might not be winnable, even if I could play perfectly. All told, if I include grinding, side quests to gain the best gear, and failed attempts, I spent 15 to 20 hours on the Dragovian trials. None of that time was truly enjoyable in the same way the main game was. In fact, all it did was show how unreliable the combat and leveling system were. The Dragon Quest VIII strengths lie heavily in its world building. The trek from town to dungeon to dungeon is enthralling, with interesting monster design, unique and fleshed out NPCs, and appealing voice acting and writing making the world a joy to experience. Added to that is what I genuinely believe to be one of the best world maps of any RPG to date, sprinkled with an engaging, albeit simple goal of capturing Dolmagus and Rapthorn. The story never takes itself too seriously, but somehow still manages to work in some darker, heavier moments like Drodane Castle and David from Arcadia. What Dragon Quest VIII does well are all the things that make this genre of game fantastic, and it makes it look easy. However, the combat is simply not up to the same standard. It does its job, and is entirely serviceable, but it's been designed around unknowable variables to ratchet up the tension of each individual fight, coupled with a leveling system designed to keep players from ever being too powerful, and suddenly what's supposed to be a challenge becomes a frustrating exercise. The fact that this only ever happens twice in the game shows just how much care went into balancing everything, but probably the smartest thing the curators did was put the Dragovian trials behind a post-game dungeon where most players won't be able to get at it. Personally, it harmed my experience more than it enhanced it, but it's entirely optional. The world benefits from the tension the combat provides, and only one fight ever reaches the stages of truly impossible in the main game. Dragon Quest VIII stands the test of time. Even today it has charm and charisma that few games can truly match. It's well and truly one of the greats.